Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to our webinar. It's great to have you here, and it's fantastic to have Professor Tamirace Fakhoury with us today, who's a Rights for Time investigator. And today she's going to be telling us about her research. But first, I'll give you a little bit of background about Rights for Time and about Tammy. So Rights for Time is a research network that's funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Our work focuses on humanitarian protection. And in particular, we're critical of crisis models of humanitarian protection that are often time limited and fail to deliver real protection that's meaningful for people on the ground. Rather, protection policy is usually embedded in the notion of an immediate crisis rather than the realities of what people on the ground face in conflict-ridden areas, in refugee and migration, forced migration, where there's protracted conflict and displacement, and there are long legacies of violence and upheaval. So the work that we are doing entails case study projects in different contexts, where we look at community-driven solutions to affording proper humanitarian protection that has real meaning in people's lives. And today, Tammy is going to be sharing with us some of her research that relates to the work that she's doing in Lebanon, along with investigators who are part of the Rights for Time Research Network, including Professor Lindsay Stonebridge and Dr. Ben Warwick, who are both from the University of Birmingham. To introduce Tammy, first, she's a fantastic colleague. I feel like I've known her for ages, and we've never met. Our entire working relationship has been throughout this terrible pandemic. But Tammy, she's an associate professor of political science and global refugee and migration studies at the Global Refugee Studies Research Group at Aalborg University in Copenhagen. She's also the scientific advisor to the Kuwait Chair at Sciences Po in Paris. Prior to joining AAU, Tamirace was an associate professor at the Lebanese American University and the director of the Institute for Social Justice and Conflict Resolution. From 2012 until 2016, she was a visiting assistant professor in the summer sessions at the University of California in Berkeley. As well as being a phenomenal co-investigator for Rights for Time, Tamirace is also a co-investigator on the Horizon 2020 project on migration governance and asylum crises. From 2014 until 2016, she was a principal co-investigator on the project Syrian Refugees, Justice Concerns, and Access to Formal and Informal Justice in Lebanon. Without further ado, it's a pleasure to introduce Tammy. Take us away.
Thank you so much, Heather, for this very generous introduction. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm thrilled to be doing this Rights for Time webinar. I'm going to be sharing my screen to start with. So my talk is going to touch on the nexus between pandemic, borderscapes, and governance. I aim to make a twofold contribution in this webinar. First, I'm going to focus on how governance in times of the pandemic has interacted with people's rights and mobility. Second, I will explore how the politics of governing the pandemic has intersected with new forms of displacement and stuckness. So to set the ground, what's the fuss about? And why is the debate on governance and pandemic politics so important? So governance is defined as the rules, norms of conduct, strategies, and techniques that states or non-state actors come up with in order to regulate action and create order for the sake of collective action. So the pandemic created a big debate on governance, or more precisely on the governance of bodies, lives, trajectories, and the governance of mobility and immobility. So states consolidated their tools of surveillance and monitoring through a myriad of methods. Let's talk about digital applications, curfews, policing to track bodies, journeys, and to limit mobility. Lately, we've also witnessed some polarizing debates on the so-called COVID passport and the more specific documents that are required to cross air, land, and sea borders. So we call the spectrum of tools that authorities develop to prescribe regulations for people's mobility as documentary regimes. And they have certainly been historically linked to notions of power and authority that the state deploys in order to govern its subjects. So in the wake of the pandemic, the terms of confinement, lockdowns, and quarantines became part of our daily lexicon or our daily lexical field. So these terms, however, have been across decades associated with situations of acute danger, such as nuclear accidents and state of emergency in the context of terrorist attacks. Also, historically speaking, the term quarantine conjures long periods of imprisonment and exile. If you were to dig into the archives, archival history. Still, with the outbreak of the pandemic, lockdowns and confinements became routinized words that have become an integral part of our daily vocabulary, whether we're on Zoom or on the phone. So in the last year and a half, we have all spent so much time, I guess, reading media articles or watching the news that have detailed the quarantine rules that ought to govern our everyday movements. And discussions about quarantine rules have also become important topics of conversations with our friends and family. So in other words, we have integrated in our everyday routine words that were usually associated with situations of acute securitization, risks, and dangers. Against this background, critical thinkers have developed a particular interest in the ways political systems and state apparatuses are using the pandemic to strengthen their infrastructures. Some have warned against the rise of new forms of invasive or intrusive biopolitics, in which our bodies and daily lives have become increasingly beyond our control. So as Charlotte Epstein of the University of Sydney, for instance, writes, the body has become a matter of national and international obsession. In this regard, the body has become subject to a spectrum of coercive governance tools, and such governance tools, I argue, have varied in terms of intrusiveness, coercion, and brutality across contexts. So take, for instance, the Philippines. Police forces have clamped down hard on people who did not respect the lockdown, killing them in some instances. China has exercised extremely tough regimes of control for lockdowns and mobility. In Europe, there have been heated debates over governments' capacity to impose curfews and to restrict mobility within territorial boundaries and beyond. So as we all know, these heated debates have escalated in some cases to full-blown protests, where citizens have in some cases revisited the very essence of the concept of the nation state in the international system. So following Max Weber's definition of what the state is, the state is defined as a set of institutions that possesses a monopoly on rule-making and on the legitimate use of force within a bounded territory. Still, the governance of the pandemic in some states brought up key controversies at the heart of this definition and its application. So what is legitimate violence in times of a pandemic, for instance? And to what extent does the state have the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within its territory and over our bodies within this territory? So many important questions have arisen here. For instance, what are the responsibilities of the state in times of the pandemic? And is the state a force for good or a force for evil when it goes far in regulating our mobility? This is not at all to say that the governance of the pandemic was not necessary. On the contrary, we are all responsible for limiting the spread of the virus. Still, such reflections, I argue, allow us to revisit how the politics of governing the pandemic was reproduced in our daily lives, and how, in some instances, governments have used citizens' feelings of uncertainty, anguish, and fear to redeploy their apparatus. I'll give some more concrete examples. More broadly, states which have lagged behind in delivering public, social, health, and economic services have instrumentalized the pandemic to deflect accountability over governance and to silence people's voices. In some countries, such as India, the state has drawn on the pandemic to further entrench economic inequalities in terms of people's access to resources and livelihoods, whether they are in rural or urban contexts. In the Arab region, and more precisely in countries that have known revolutionary episodes, such as Lebanon and Iraq, governments have used the pandemic to muzzle freedoms and to restrict people's right to mobilize and to take to the streets. In Lebanon, for instance, the government has drawn on the pretext of the pandemic to disperse crowds and limit gatherings and protests, notwithstanding rising levels of anguish. So this has substantially, as perhaps some of you know, this discourse and this practice has substantially weakened the wave of popular mobilization that had gained ground in 2019. According to some Lebanese intellectuals, COVID-19 and the way it was governed became one of the pivotal factors that enabled the Lebanese government to further escape its responsibilities and obscure accountability amid cascading crises, whether we are talking about the financial collapse or the Beirut blasts in August 2020. So the government could thus shift the blame away and justify deliberate inaction in times of Corona. And Lebanon's sectarian political parties could also draw on the coronavirus amid rising levels of poverty to convince their communal base that they can offer financial solutions and safety nets. Thus, in dispensing vaccines and services, some political parties that have been that have been in a way discredited during the Lebanese protests, those same political parties were able to stage a comeback in the context of the pandemic, although their popularity, as I've just said, had significantly declined during the Thawra, or Lebanon's popular uprising of 2019. In Syria, the regime has also instrumentalized the pandemic to brand itself as an economic savior that can restore the dignity and well-being to people as their lives have gradually crumbled. So in yet another perspective, and I'm talking about the global scene here, the COVID-19 pandemic and the way it has been governed exacerbated fault lines of inequality and vulnerability, leaving some people more precarious than others. For instance, LGBTQ communities have been particularly impacted, especially in political regimes that deprive them from economic recovery programs, job opportunities, or access to health. Even in more democratic or so-called liberal settings, pandemic politics has been a fertile ground for the rise of polarizing debates on trans rights and gender identity. So many reports show that LGBTQ communities were harder hit in some areas, such as job loss, and they experience increasing mental health problems. And this, of course, applies not only to the global South, but to the global North in general. Ironically enough, in some places where people are preoccupied with questions of survival and livelihoods, the state's efforts to govern the pandemic through imposing curfews and regulating access to the vaccine, those efforts were not always taken seriously by the people. In South Sudan, for instance, the pandemic is not on the top of the list of people's problems. Rather, problems such as flooding, inundations, hunger, and malaria are perceived as far more important. In Lebanon, again, I come back to Lebanon, where I'm doing my field research. In poorer areas such as Tripoli or Akkar in the north, people have disobeyed state's rules, opening their businesses while arguing that survival and hunger are far more significant issues than the pandemic. So, building on these insights and on this, general background, I would like to touch briefly on how the politics of governing the pandemic has not only led to redrawing the authority of the state apparatus and its responsibilities for the organization of communal life, but this politics has also led to the emergence of new forms of precarious mobility or displacement and immobility or stuckness. So COVID-19 devastated economies and the entrenchment of hard borders have spurred a paradoxical phenomenon in which immobilization has been interlaced with complex forms of displacement. And this is what I'm currently researching. So as states have shut down mobility worldwide, refugees and transit migrants have been particularly immobilized, unable to pursue applications on resettlement or to seek for safe secondary migration journeys that could give them, more dignified lives. At the same time, in the context of COVID, devastated economies, and despite the fact that many states have shut down mobility and imposed hard borders, displacement has not abated, unlike what many reports tried, to argue at the beginning of the pandemic. Indeed, many refugees and transit migrants have lately taken uncertain trips in the risky waters of the Mediterranean or in the Arizona desert. So in my research, I'm using the analytical lens of pandemic borderscapes to capture these dual forms of mobility and immobility. I define pandemic borderscapes as highly conflictual and precarious environments in which individuals on the move have experienced entrapment or complex forms of displacement. I argue that these forms of displacement are non-linear. They may entail onward journeys, journeys forward, but also journeys backwards. I mean return, but also re-return. In the sense, they defy the logic of onward migration or immobility as series of linear moments that can be defined in time and space. I argue that they interact with an incoherent, lens of temporalities, actions, and strategies. So let me get a bit more specific. First, the COVID-19 pandemic has extended periods of mobility for refugees awaiting resettlement, whether in the global north or in the global south. Research shows how this has led to worsening their psychological and economic conditions, as they could neither afford the waiting, nor did they have existing safety nets to offset the costs imposed by these extended periods of immobility. Lives stalled while awaiting resettlement is one out of the many examples of stuckness. So the pandemic has also seen the constitution of new zones of entrapment as refugees and transit migrants seeking to move onwards or to return to their country of origin were immobilized in buffer zones. For instance, displaced Syrians in Lebanon who were seeking to return home found themselves stuck in a buffer zone between Syria and Lebanon, where they could not move for days, as they were denied entry at the Syrian-Lebanese border because they had taken either a so-called illegal crossing or because they couldn't submit a coronavirus test while getting a permission from the Syrian embassy to return. So with their return to Lebanon from Syria, some had to go to government-run quarantine facilities. So we really, of course, do not know what conditions prevail in such facilities or whether, Syrians there have experienced regime reprisals. Second, the pandemic created new pressures, forms, and itineraries of displacement. Examples are endless, and they span various regional contexts. People started fleeing, as I said, COVID-devastated economies from Brazil, Cuba, India, or Venezuela, trying to reach the United States, only to find themselves, in some cases, pushed back or stuck at border walls. In the context of the economic meltdown, which was exacerbated by the pandemic in Lebanon, Syrian refugees and poorer Lebanese who found themselves in extremely desperate situations took the boat from the northern city of Tripoli to Cyprus, in some cases only to be pushed back or to drown. So here I'm just giving some, examples to set the general scene. What I want to say is that examples are countless. I could talk about this forever. But what I want to say is that bureaucracies, borders, the processing of documents and regulations on corona tests have converged to exacerbate existing forms of displacement, to make them morph or transform into newer forms of displacement, and at the same time to create new borderscapes within which displaced individuals have become stuck or have landed in situations of renewed displacement or even overlapping states of displacement, as the Syrian-Lebanese buffer zone suggests. Why is this debate important? As of now, we don't have, much evidence, or we don't know much about how these COVID-related forms of displacement and stuckness, we don't know much about them, but we also don't know how they have unfolded through time and space. And we don't know much about their implications on asylum rights and, on asylum systems and on what we call border justice. Mapping, however, such new forms of displacement and stuckness is very important for various reasons. And here I will pose 3 questions that I hope, will stimulate our conversation afterwards. Firstly, how has the pandemic politics interacted with concepts of border justice? And has the pandemic made it easier or more acceptable for governments to close their borders and reconfigure their asylum systems? Secondly, what kind of protection has been available for the so-called pandemic refugees who are out there thrown in liminality at a time when normal asylum systems have been halted? Thirdly, and most importantly, what agency or bottom-up power have refugees and migrants been able to exercise and deploy in times of pandemic politics? So these are 3 questions I'm particularly interested in unpacking in my current research. This leads me to my concluding thoughts, and here I would like to end with the brighter side of the story. Without a doubt, as I've tried to explain, the politics of the pandemic behooves us to revisit how state authorities and organizations have determined very intrusively our trajectories. Yet the pandemic has also been an opportunity to create alternative and critical forms of governance from below. So examples abound. Civil society and grassroots communities in countries such as Iraq, Syria, Brazil, Venezuela, and further afield have drawn on the pandemic to lobby for a more coherent societal response to the pandemic, or to create people-centric initiatives in which the people themselves could offer alternative models of humanitarianism. Perhaps an interesting example would be how Palestinian refugees in the Badawi camp in the north of Lebanon have created their own awareness-raising initiatives and safety nets to support each other amid a broader context where state and international authorities gave them marginal importance. So researchers at UCL have carried out ethnographic work in the Badawi camp, showing how refugees have come up with their own refugee-led local responses to counter the pandemic and to provide health services to each other. Refugees have further collected donations for the less fortunate, defying state-led or UNRWA-led or UNHCR-led forms of humanitarianism and positioning themselves as key agents who can realize protection. To conclude, I have some takeaways that we could discuss in the Q&A. First, it is important to remain vigilant of how states have drawn on COVID-19 as an opportunity to securitize rights and develop new documentary regimes to track more vulnerable individuals. Second, it is important to keep in mind that the governance of the pandemic has unlocked and exacerbated multi-layered and overlapping economic and political crises. This has made people's trajectories even more precarious, but also fuzzier. Third, as states have shut down mobility worldwide, refugees and transit migrants have experienced multiple and complex forms of immobilization and displacement. And this is what I'm particularly interested in, because these forms range from being entrapped at buffer zones to embarking on perilous trips, returning to their home country or returning to where they initially fled from upon realizing that insecurity prevails and that the conflict has not abated. Of course, the case of Syrian refugees here arises as a case in point. My last takeaway is that despite those grim scenarios, the pandemic has also opened space and opportunities for bottom-up mobilization for people to rally for justice and craft their own humanitarian responses. I think it's very important, very crucial to document such initiatives and highlight their relevance in our daily discussions. I will stop here. I look forward to our discussion. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Tammy. That was wonderful. I was trying to find the hand clap. Wow, that's phenomenal. Do you want to take us a bit on a journey with you through your case study and talk about how it intersects with what you were saying? So I saw so many linkages.
Yes, of course. So as I said, I'm basically working right now on this theme of stuckness and displacement. And I'm taking, of course, the case of Syrian displacement as an illustrative example. So what I'm doing is that I am trying to revisit, the notion, the linear notion of displacement or stuckness or immobility, as defined moments in time that can be explained through predictable temporality, strategies, actions. What I'm trying to investigate is how, for instance, these forms of stuckness and displacement are leading to incoherent pandemic borderscapes, which are so hard to project and which also behoove us to revisit, the concepts of border justice, asylum systems justice, but also the fact that all of a sudden, refugees, transit migrants, but also more broadly individuals, have to struggle with a continuum of temporalities and spatialities in which they would have to reposition themselves anew, not knowing, what awaits them. So it is this really this moment of precarity, but also this moment of unpredictability and non-linearity that I am particularly interested in capturing in my field research. Yeah. And I'm particularly interested in seeing also how this intersects with our project, Rights for Time, and the lens of temporalities and spatialities.
Mm-hmm. A lot of what we want to do with Rights for Time is to come up with a lexicon, a new way of expressing what heretofore has been inexpressible for so many reasons. And when you talked about people sometimes going backwards, returning, yes. That's something that you don't hear much about. I don't know if you'd care to elaborate a bit more about that, what you're seeing in Lebanon or elsewhere. Lindsay, I think you can join us. I think you're a panelist. At least that's what it says on my screen. So feel free to jump in. Oh, there you are. Hi.
Hi.
You.
Hi. Tammy, that was wonderful. Thank you for the clarity, which is very welcome. I think as always, your clarity is really welcome. I just wonder, there's two things I'd really like to hear you talk more about in the context of Rights for Time and this work. what your presentation showed on the one hand was quite clearly how we could, a kind of common sense model would be, we have a refugee history that stretches from the 20th century to now and is getting more and more complex as states do different things, and as they do different things with human rights law, and they do different things with outsourcing, and as well as increasing their infrastructure. And what your presentation did on the one hand was knock the idea that there's a refugee history and then there's this crisis called the pandemic. I mean, clearly the pandemic is a crisis, but it's also part of a longer history, both about the way we live in the planet, the way we eat, what we do to the environment, how we produce these viruses, how we create the context, not only for people to have to leave their countries, and you know, climate forced displacement is part of the refugee story, but also keep on producing crisis. So I guess my question here is to sort of think a bit about what happens when you put a big time picture on these. What happens to the notion of crisis? What happens to the notion of a state of emergency when there's a kind of continual long history, both of nation states policing their borders, but also of extraction and accumulative capitalism, carbon capitalism, etc., which is producing these histories?
Thank you. Fascinating questions. So first, I'll answer Heather's question regarding, you know, those blurry forms of displacement. Regarding return and return, as I said, I'm working on the case of displacement, Syrian displacement from Lebanon, right? Like Syrian refugees who return to Syria. So many of them lately returned, however, re-returned to Lebanon according to the research that is carried out by the Refugee Protection Watch, you know, because they weren't informed of what is happening there, and because they landed in situations of extreme despair, anguish, and precarity, where they could not, you know, make well-informed decisions. And this is what I'm interested in, is how, you know, people, when they are living in this moment of crisis, no longer have a linear sense of time planning and of the future, but how sometimes, you know, they are propelled in indistinct trajectories of displacement or immobility, where they can no longer, in a way, assess the implications of these decisions on their lives, presents, pasts perhaps, but also futures. So I'm looking at, you know, forward displacement as in onward journeys, but also backward displacement in which you decide to return, but maybe you re-return, right, as a way of this blurry pandemic borderscape in which we can gain an insight into how people are trapped, you know, by crises, by asylum systems, and also by the way state apparatuses have developed, you know, documentary regimes to restrict people's movements, but also to have more control over their aspirations and daily lives. Lindsay, your question is something that I've been thinking about. And of course, my case study is just, you know, perhaps a small sequence on the larger continuum of refugee histories. And this is what I've been thinking about. Is the pandemic really a critical juncture for us to talk about, you know, these forms of precarity and displacement? Or is it just an illustrative point in time that allow us to capture how states and international orders have always done that? For instance, when it comes to my key case study, Lebanon, I was curious to know, you know, whether the pandemic has really acted as a critical juncture in the way the state has responded to refugee policies or not, or this has only exacerbated precursory crises and overlapping and multi-layered crises. So I tend to think that we have to look at the pandemic as, you know, a turning point that in a way coexists and overlaps with prior histories, prior policy legacies, prior temporalities. And perhaps it is an opportunity to empirically assess, you know, how such documentary regimes, how such, governance apparatuses develop in a specific period of time and try to get a firmer hold on people's lives and trajectories.
Coming back, that's really interesting. So I think in that context, the two things are really interesting there. One is the way in which the pandemic is presented as a crisis to cover up other failings that you brought out in your paper, but also to exercise other forms of control. And I think that's absolutely right. And without actually surrendering to the argument of, like, I mean, like me, you're in France at the moment, and we know where the anti-pass sanitaire stuff can go, but without surrendering to a kind of conspiracy nature of the state, but to actually say there's something going on in that presentation. The other thing would be that we came up in your presentation, which I'd like to hear more about, is how does that work? Because the other characteristic feature of one of the characteristic features of the pandemic, it seems to me, both in the global south and increasingly in the global north, is that the state has been shambolic. I mean, states are shambolic. I mean, this is partly because they are reacting to unprecedented circumstances. But so I think it so happens, and certainly the case with the UK and up until recently with the US, the state really was shambolic. It wasn't responding to crises that made it shambolic. It was shambolic to begin with. And in Lebanon, that's clearly the case, that there's a relationship between the shambolic nature of the state. It's a kind of failure to be a state failure we're talking about, in relation to the other historical theme, which is uprising, insurrection, demonstration, seizing of the public space, seizing back the state. Could you kind of speculate a bit more about that relationship between shambolic states, trying to get the state to work, and also uprising or revolution attacks, particularly in terms of the legacy of 2019 in Lebanon?
Absolutely. So first of all, I wanted to come back to this initial, debate I had on governance. And here I wanted to say that you are right, Lindsay, that when we talk about governance and the state apparatus, we tend to think about the state, deploying and consolidating its governance apparatus or its infrastructural power over citizens in the pandemic. But at times, I mean, the state worldwide has lapsed into deliberate inaction, or in policy incoherence, or in strategic ambiguity, for instance, vis-a-vis the pandemic. So I'm also interested in the ways this, projected power of the state has hidden or concealed, forms of state inaction, state inefficiency, or the inability of the state to react to such crises. Of course, and Lebanon here arises as a case in point, because this governance apparatus that we are talking about, whether we're talking about curfews, whether we're talking about policing, whether we are talking about dispersing the crowds when people, staged protests, these are also acts of, weakness, of inaction, of deliberate inaction that deflect accountability from the core problems. Whether we are talking about the financial collapse, the vertiginous financial collapse in Lebanon, or whether we're talking about the Beirut blast, or how suddenly, the state started, in a way, building on the repertoire of the pandemic to disperse protesters and activists who were trying to rally in safe and communal spaces. So what came to my mind after writing this presentation is that perhaps I presented governance as too much of a coherent, assemblage or way of looking at how states reacted to the pandemic. And what I'm interested in is, how you talk about the state being incoherent or inefficient, or delving into, a repertoire of policy actions and inactions in order to respond to the crisis. And this also builds, on policy legacies that are not that haven't only happened, or that haven't only started now with the pandemic, but we can look at when we look at the history of the Middle East, for instance, that this is not new, right? And that many states have always drawn on this rhetoric and discourse of the crisis, whether we are talking about a security crisis, or we are talking about, you know, certain war or certain conflicts or a geopolitical conflict, in order to disperse protesters and to geopoliticize, you know, uprisings, and to make them, you know, inimical to the state order or to public order. And this is what I'm interested in. Because in Lebanon, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic and the way public officials depicted it as disruptive of, you know, Lebanon's, in a way, safety or security is reminiscent of broader geopolitical conflicts, where policy officials, you know, have also talked about, for instance, the risk that protests could, you know, in a way, unleash when it comes to the outbreak of another civil war in Lebanon, or to the spillovers or to the vulnerability of Lebanon to the broader, you know, regional upheavals that were happening. So for me, and this is very interesting, we shouldn't exceptionalize the COVID-19 pandemic, and we shouldn't like have just a unidimensional way of looking at governance. But I think it's very important to track how COVID-19, you know, has built on a repertoire of governance, in a way, strategies, but also, you know, inactions when it comes to responding to citizens' safety, citizens' liberties, or restricting and muzzling, you know, civil and public and political freedoms.
Do you think also, Tammy, so that's linked to how, I mean, governments in Europe as well do this, that there's been a kind of corruption of the word care. I mean, you mentioned to begin with, you know, obviously we're talking about biopolitics here, and then there's, you know, there's the biopolitics of refugee control, migrant control. There's the biopolitics of the pandemic. There's the biopolitics of exposing your population to explosion, and there's a biopolitics of shooting them when they're demonstrating them, or beating them up when they're demonstrating. And you said very beautifully, there's this kind of, you know, repertoire. But on the other hand, there's a sort of inflation of the discourse of care, which usually we think belongs to, you know, humanitarianism and to the good guys. So some of that is clearly about the mobilization of fear, but there's also this sort of creeping discourse around care. So, you know, like in the UK, it would be, you know, Priti Patel really cares about migrants drowning in the sorry, in the channel, the Manche. That's why she's employing violent pushbacks. So could you comment on that a bit about how the discourse of care and humanitarianism has been mobilized within this kind of repertoire, state repertoire that you've been talking about?
Absolutely, this is a fascinating question. And I don't think it's something unique to this period that, you know, security discourses have coexisted with humanitarian discourses. I mean, historically, if you look at also the legacy of a humanitarianism, you know, we could look at international organizations taking care of migrants, refugees, and citizens, but also taking care in such a way that they would want to discipline them and empower them the way they want. Right, so this is a double-edged dimension of humanitarianism and care, where also discourses of security coexist with the politics of well-being and the politics of care. And it's very important, actually, to be vigilant of how, you know, securitization does not only unfold, you know, through speech acts of security, but may also unfold through speech acts of humanitarianism. And this is what I have been interested in looking at, for instance, when states or non-state actors you know, deploy this rhetoric of care, or try to, in a way, enforce certain measures because they care for the migrants and for the refugees. I think that it's very crucial for us as social scientists to try to assess what happens there. How did they use these, you know, discursive practices and these actions, and how did these, you know, actions reverberate on people's, refugees and migrants' lives? How have they reconfigured, the concepts of border justice? Have they made it, for instance, more acceptable to change asylum systems, to bend the rules, in times of the crisis? So I guess I still have much research to carry out on this topic, and to see how, discourses and practices of security and humanitarianism and care interlace, and how they change, or they make, the very concept of protection shift. But I guess that, we are living in fascinating times, right? And something that I feel particularly motivated to do is to empirically investigate, how did this work out? How did the sociology of everyday deployment of security practices impact our lives? And we can see that, for instance, I was interested in looking at the example of the buffer zone between Lebanon and Syria as a polycentric field, where you see how refugees' precarity, but also bureaucracies, embassies, COVID-19 tests, all of these, come together in order to forge this very moment of security and humanitarianism at the same time, and where you also have, you're supposed to have, humanitarian organizations watching the borders, or at least documenting what's happening. How does this change the landscape? Does it make it, more dissonant? Does it bring, a sight of tensions and friction? This is also another question that I'm particularly interested in answering, i.e. the question as to how this politics of security and humanitarianism create more fuzziness and friction and tensions among a myriad of actors who come together in order to solve the so-called crisis.
Do you think, wondering about that, because as you were talking about the buffer zones and these hybrid spaces, I had sort of two thoughts in mind. One is, the work that's been done that say actually borders never are borders, they always are actually hybrid spaces. So if you look at, the wall in Palestine, or if you look at Calais and the channel, they're all, and of course Arizona and Mexico, they always are zones of supreme fuzziness. But as you were talking, the other thing that came to mind, and you mentioned this in your talk, was Elena Fidian-Casimir's work on Badawi camp.
Yes.
And in some way, the Lebanese Palestinian refugee camps have been zones of fuzziness in similar ways that you describe, both subject to humanitarian law, subject to nation state rule, that they have, that people don't have any rights over, don't have any citizenship rights within, subject to more local politics, etc., etc. So I was wondering if you thought maybe, particularly in the case of Syria, Lebanon, and the Middle East, the long-standing Palestinian camps in Badawi, 1955. Are already precursors of the fuzzy zones that we're now seeing everywhere. I mean, I'm thinking here as well, Tamim al-Baghdadi once said, he coined a new word, which was Palestinization. He said, I think it was in 2016, just after the refugee crisis was becoming a topic of public debate. This is a process of Palestinianization, whereas migrants and refugees will end up pretty much in some similar fuzzy zones as Palestinians have been locked into.
Of course, these are fascinating insights. So just let me first, say why I alluded specifically to Fidian-Casimir's ethnographic research on the Badawi camp, because there has been so much focus on Syrian displacement that, as you said, we forget also that there are overlapping forms of displacement in the Middle East, and especially in Lebanon, where at times Palestinians have become marginal actors in the humanitarian discourse worldwide. And I think that this example is very powerful because it makes us reflect on those overlapping temporalities of displacement, and also make us, in a way, remember the very fact that we ought to account for refugees' agency, although they have been forgotten, although they have been, in a way, marginalized and relegated, by policy spheres. So in this particular time where we are seeing, you know, more, let's say, complex forms of displacement in the Middle East because of collapsing economies, because of collapsing social contracts. I think it's very important for us to understand how, you know, the case of Syrian displacement overlaps and builds on what you call the previous legacy of Palestinian protracted displacement, and how, in a way, you know, those two cases build on each other and coexist along the continuum of precarity and vulnerability. And I guess that our case study at Rights for Time specifically wants to inquire into this zone of temporality or continuation, but also disruption, you know, in the case of Lebanon, and how today we shed the light on Syrian displacement also like as a humanitarian discourse. However, we forget that this case very much builds on previous legacies, previous policy legacies, but also previous humanitarian legacies that we ought to unpack, revisit, and rediscover a little bit. Perhaps, you know, these previous cases have a lot to teach us about the way we should look at displacement today. I just wanted to add also as well that this case is not only unique to Lebanon, but also to Jordan, for instance, where the EU has cooperated with the Jordanian government on the EU-Jordan Compact in 2016, which the Jordan Compact, as we all know, facilitates trade, you know, schemes or trade with Jordan, and also gives grants, concessions, and gives financial support in exchange for the Jordanian state facilitating Syrian refugees access to the labor market. While this is presented, you know, as an iconic example of, you know, how financial instruments can sometimes leverage states to and open their, you know, become a bit, in a way, open their labor markets, but also facilitate access to rights. This obfuscates the fact that in Jordan, there is a historical legacy of displacement and how the very case of the EU-Jordan Compact has, in a way, relegated, you know, many migrants and refugees, whether we're talking about Iraqi, Palestinian individuals, or Egyptian migrants and others, who felt a little bit, in a way, betrayed by this humanitarian, in a way, discourse and practice, which builds on displacement as something that occurs in time and space, in the here and the now, forgetting the previous legacies of displacement and how they build on each other, and, you know, how they have continuous implications for people's lives.
Let's just see where Heather's gone. She's vanished.
Oh, I'm here. I'm
listening to us.
Everyone in my house is COVID positive, so it's kind of funny. Like, everybody seems to think that the pandemic is over, and I feel like perhaps it's only alive and well in my house. So sorry, apologies. It's lunchtime. I'm homeschooling, but it's been a really interesting discussion. I've been hanging on it. I'm going to re-listen to this again because I think it just reverberates everything that you're saying across all of our case studies. I've been thinking about sexual violence survivors in Kenya, and I'm thinking about you know, just with the crackdowns that they've had and how difficult it's been to get services there, and how vulnerabilities to begin with resulted in repeat victimization. And how the kind of the response to that is always to think about the particular most recent event, shall we say, the violation itself rather than the larger picture, and everything that you're saying in relation to Lebanon and precarity. I think just really it transcends that context into so many other ones, and the politics of it, which is what your expertise is, Tamirace, is just really fascinating to think through. And so I'm really eagerly awaiting the results of your case study to see how it might inform what we're doing, which comes from a different disciplinary perspective, but can, you know, I think can be so much more extended and greatly informed by the work that you're doing with your case study, and beyond that, all the fascinating projects in which you're working.
Thank you so much, Heather. First of all, I wanted to thank you for this opportunity and also for the opportunity to tie my current research to our rights for time, lens on temporalities, because this made me think, about how governance, stuckness, and displacement unfold in a broader continuum, that builds on temporalities and specialities. And as Lindsay said, when we talk about borders, but also when we talk about temporalities, we are dealing in all cases with fuzziness. Fuzziness is always there. So the question is, how did the pandemic or the governance of the pandemic add to this fuzziness? Has it added to this fuzziness, or in what way has it, in a way, recreated it, reconfigured it? So I loved, Lindsay, your, fascinating questions, your challenging questions that made me even, think and rethink my theoretical framework and the various conceptual in a way, insights that one has to contend with when looking at this very fuzzy intersection between governance, pandemic politics, stuckness, and displacement. So thanks again for hosting me and for listening.
Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Lindsay, for moderating. It's been a fascinating discussion. Well, thank you everybody for attending. I don't see any questions in the chat, but last call, we have a couple of minutes. Does anyone want to chime in, ask anything? Okay, well, thank you. It's been great to see you. And we will put this recording onto the Rights for Time website, along with further information connecting you to Tammy's case study. Tammy, last word over to you.
I'm sorry, I raised my hand by mistake. That was unintentional. Okay. No further comments. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Great to see you. I'm looking forward to talking very soon.
Yeah.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.